And I'd like to invite you to please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, this morning we have the opportunity to engage in that wonderful annual tradition, the Stewardship Sermon. This is where, if I was in an old school Baptist church in the South, I'd instruct the deacons to shut the doors so no one could get out. Talking about money oftentimes makes people feel nervous and anxious, uncomfortable. And I remember I was fortunate enough to start my early career with Peter Gomes, who was the minister at Harvard. And if there's one thing Peter wasn't shy about, it was asking for money. And he taught me a lot. He also liked to sprinkle in a little bit of humor, and he would bring up these old classics when talking about stewardship. A couple come to mind. One was, I remember him looking out at the congregation there at Memorial Church, and he says, I've got good news for you, and I've got bad news for you. The good news is we have all the money we need. The bad news is it's still in your pockets. Another one he brought up, I remember he said a couple times, is this old classic story of the IRS agent who's doing an audit of a wealthy church member for a church in New York City. And this IRS agent calls up the senior minister of one of these big pulpits. I believe, as Peter told it was Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church. And he calls up the senior minister and he says, is so-and-so in your congregation? The minister says, well, yes, he is. He says, well, did so-and-so make a pledge of $50,000 last year to your campaign? And there's this pause. The minister says, he will. The reality is, it's important to talk about money in church because money matters. You work very hard for the money that you have. You work very hard for that, and that money helps provide amazing things in your life. The chance to live in a wonderful community like Wellesley or Newton or Natick or some other communities in the area. Gives you the chance to spend time with family and friends, to support things with your kids. Money matters tremendously, and so therefore in a place like church, where we're supposed to talk about truth, how can we talk about truth unless we also talk about money and what we do with it? It's often said that if you want to know someone's values, just look at their checkbook. That will tell you a lot. It tells you a lot about what you care about and what you value. And one of the things that I know you all value and that people value is the opportunity to give money to causes that you care about, to charitable causes. It's something that's important to each one of you. And there are three basic reasons that tend to drive giving to charitable causes. Three great things that motivate us. The first is just that basic instinct of compassion. We see someone in need and we want to help them. Maybe you're someone who sees someone in need on the streets and you're one of those people that really takes joy in making sure you give at least a little something to someone when they ask. The other day I was in the gym and one of the ads that came on the television on the screens there was an advertisement for the Save the Children International NGO, an NGO that works with children in need around the globe. And it showed these moving images of children in need around the globe. And yes, there's a whole bunch of problems with some of those fundraising techniques. But nevertheless, it moves the compassion within you. I was watching that and I said, gosh, maybe I should make a donation. Compassion motivates us. Maybe that compassion motivates you to support, say, for instance, organizations that work with homeless people in our area. Homelessness is a vastly complex issue. And there are people who spend their lives trying to alleviate some of the ills that are around that. And I know that motivates many of you. Maybe you give money to organizations that help people with mental illness. When you've struggled with mental illness or know people in your family who've struggled with mental illness or friends, you know how important this is. And you also know how few resources are there for people when they need it, particularly those who don't have money. And so therefore, maybe that's one reason why you want to give, is that sense of compassion. And this is where churches are so central to this sense of compassionate giving. For starters, churches give money to organizations in the community that are doing good work. So when you give money to a church, one of the things you're doing is you're giving money to organizations that are good organizations. But far more importantly, churches are places where you can get connected to such organizations, where you get to learn about them, you get to volunteer your time with them. Churches are not just like a United Way. It's actually, they're places where people can come and be inspired to get involved in the community and to figure out what's actually going on. When I was in Houston last year, I remember being at a gala luncheon for this organization that we supported in the church called Memorial Assistance Ministries, which helps people that are mostly homeless, but also people who are in difficult circumstances in the area around the church. And I was at this table with a church member, and much to my surprise, in the midst of the luncheon, it was announced that this church member and her husband had actually covered the costs of the whole gala so that all the money raised could go to the organization. It was also announced that this church member had given $500,000 to buy the piece of property next to their facility so they could do their next stage of expansion. I had no idea about this. But here's a way in which the church connected someone in the church with an organization, inspired them, and then that donation got multiplied many-fold over. That's one of the things that churches do. In addition, churches also found, think of all the things in society that have been founded by churches, all the charitable organizations, either by churches themselves or by church people. Hospitals, educational institutions, institutions helping those in need. Nearly every one of them in society on some level has a link back to a religious institution. When I was at Houston, again, I talked about Memorial Assistance Ministries. I'd love to start something similar in this area. What this was the churches in this particular area, in the Memorial area of Houston, they had this issue where people would go from church to church to church asking for support. And the churches felt that there has to be some better way to help these folks in need than just having a gift card to give out when they come by. So the churches got together and formed an organization where the churches could sort of send people to that organization where they had professionally trained social workers that could work with these individuals. They could provide rental support and utility support by looking through what they needed. One of the big things they did there was ESL classes, English as a second language classes, for the large Hispanic population that existed in the area and needed help learning English. It was an incredible organization. It was started by the churches. One of the members of the First Congregational in Houston started an organization called Raise Up Families that looked at one of the areas in homelessness that was particularly troublesome, which is when you have people who are not permanently homeless but rental insecure. One of the impacts of that is that people have to move from place to place to place, couch search for different friends, and that affects tremendously the children in those households because they have to go from school district to school district to school district, and they get put behind. So this organization was created entirely by volunteer funds from various church organizations to provide caseworker support for these individuals, to teach them financial literacy, to give assistance when needed, to help them so they can stay in a home and their kids can stay in their schools. The success rate of this organization was off the charts. Here, at the Hills Church, you think of the Family Promise Network, that the Hills Church and others got together to work and found. These are the amazing things that churches do. In addition to that, churches also train our kids in the values of giving. We teach our kids about how important it is to care for those in the margins. These are important lessons that oftentimes they're not getting in other parts of society. In fact, in other parts of society, they're getting very different messages. Churches do that. When I was considering going to divinity school, one thing I did was I got reconnected with Ann Adams here at the Hills Church. And so Ann brought me along with the youth group that winter on the annual coat drive to go into Boston to hand out coats to folks who were homeless in Boston. And then one of these homeless people was giving us, including all the youth, a tour of where he slept and where his friends slept, and gave a description of his life to these youth. It's amazing to see the eyes opened up of these kids. Churches do that. They teach people compassion and the importance of it. That's one reason why we give, to help, to be compassionate. Another reason to give, though, is you give because you really care about an organization and the success of that organization because it's touched you. So, for instance, let's say you go to a university or a school and you're an alumnus, a proud alumnus of that organization. And of course, the day after you graduate, they send you a fundraising letter. And people are proud to support those institutions because they help them and they want them to be successful. That's another reason why people give. So for instance, you love a particular arts organization and it's touched you in certain ways, and so you want to give to make it a success. Same thing is true with churches. This church has touched your soul in various ways by the people you've met. The people who've cared for you when you've needed that care, or expressing care for others when they've needed it. That kind of care can be transformative. The fun times you've had, the times of crying. Think of all the baptisms, the weddings that have been here, the funerals, the music that's elevated your soul, the chance to meet God in a real way. This place has touched your soul, and so you want it to succeed. And that's one reason to give. I know this congregation gave incredibly generously to the capital campaign that we had just a couple years ago. And I want to keep building on that for the success for the future. One of the things that's coming up this year is, tragically, we have to replace Anne-Marie Holloway, which I'm very happy that she's going, and I love her dearly, and I celebrate her departure. But we have to, I don't celebrate her, I just felt, you know what I mean. Anyway, so we have a position to fill. And the reality is that finding a good minister with a specialty who can really energize a youth program is not an easy thing. But we're in a great position to do that. But that person that we might find might not be, for instance, in the New England area. We might find a minister from a different part of the country. And if you have to encourage someone to relocate their family to Metro West Boston, one of the things that can help attract a leading candidate is money. We want this youth program to be successful. That'll require an investment. This place has touched your heart and touched the hearts of your youth. It's a good reason to commit. But there's a third reason, particularly for religious people, of why we give. And this reason comes up in our reading this morning that Jeff read a moment before. I love this passage. From the book of Deuteronomy. This passage is over 2,500 years old. And here in the book of Deuteronomy, we hear these words that, again, if you're harvesting in your field, you intentionally leave some behind that you don't pick up. And you leave it behind for the widow, for the orphan, for the alien, aka immigrant, refugee, someone who's been displaced by violence or famine or some other crisis. And then the text says, because remember that you were once a slave in Egypt, and God is commanding you to do this. One of the reasons why religious people give is because they hear as a command from God to be generous. That's true for Jews, that's true for Muslims, that's true for Christians. Religious people give far more money to organizations outside of religious organizations than people who are not religious. Because it goes back to this command. Because the reality is, religious people understand how fickle life can be. Think in your life what has led to your success. Oftentimes there's one person you met, a mentor who guided you in the right way, one conversation you had. Maybe there was one business deal that worked out that launched your whole company to make it happen. Somewhere along the line, something happened that could have gone a different direction. And for other people, it often has. There's a lot of contingency in our life, far more than a lot of people like to acknowledge. And just as that fickleness can lead to very good things, also bad things can happen just as suddenly. When my father was 58 years old and in very good health, one day he began urinating blood. Went to the doctor, he had advanced stage 4 kidney cancer and was given less than 6 months to live at age 58. Life is fickle. But the reality is, because we know that life is fickle, when we sit around and see all the great blessings that we have, that should lead to a sense of gratitude that has with it some obligation for religious people. When I look at my life, I'm really fortunate. I was someone who, I was born with a good brain. I could memorize a lot of details, which is really useful in schools. Did I do anything to deserve that or earn that? No. That's just purely DNA. I also had parents who loved me incredibly and unconditionally. I grew up in an amazing community. I had wonderful siblings. I got sent to the best schools that my parents could find. I had all the benefits laid at my feet. Have I worked hard? Sure. But I have no illusions of the fact that I won a lottery in life. And at Roxbury Latin, one of the things about Roxbury Latin in gold writing in the main refectory, main assembly hall, is the lines of Jesus that you find on the front of the bulletin. Those to whom much has been given, of them shall much be required. The school never wanted us to forget the fact that we were incredibly lucky. And with that luck came responsibility to go do something with it. I remember back when I was working as a chaplain at Harvard, one of the things I did was I volunteered at the Suffolk County Prison along with some of the undergrads to be a good chaplain there. And at one point I was tutoring this guy to get his GED so that he could have a high school equivalency degree. And as we were going through fractions, I remember. And we're going through these fractions and, he's taking the time to go through it. And then finally he had one of those aha moments. He's like, okay, I finally get it. I was like, oh, that's great. Whenever you're tutoring someone, they get it. You're like, woohoo. And then he paused and he's like, I remember back in third grade, all this stuff didn't make any sense. So I just stopped paying attention. I was like, you just stopped paying attention in school? He's like, yeah, school didn't matter to me after that. And here I was, I thought to myself, if I had had problems with fractions in third grade, I would have had my parents working with me, they would have gotten tutors, they would have talked to the teacher and the principal. This guy had none of that. And there I was talking to him in prison. We are incredibly lucky. And for religious people, that carries with it an obligation. But also it's important to remember we were once slaves in Egypt. If our lives are good now, I bet there are times in your life where things have not been as good. And it's important to recall those times as well. Or not been as easy. When I was in divinity school, like a typical grad student, I had a negative income. So I had a good scholarship, I had some money saved up, I was trying to earn money working as a TA and working in churches. Churches don't pay very well. And I remember, whenever I was in a grocery store, I can get a bag of the yellow onions because they're cheaper, and, the big blocks of cheese, get those and chop those up, and, plum tomatoes are the cheapest kind of tomatoes you can buy, so get the plum tomatoes, But I remember my first year at divinity school sitting down and saying, what should I give to the Hills Church? I was a member of the Hills Church, and I thought, what could I do? And so I decided to make a pledge of $5 a week. So I committed to giving $5 a week to the Hills Church, even though I wasn't worshiping here. This was my church. So I made that pledge. And the next year, I decided to up that pledge to $10 a week. And then at the end of my third year at divinity school, I came back up here for the summer. I had to do a hospital chaplaincy rotation to get ordained. I did mine at Mass General Hospital. And as I was applying, I realized that there was a tuition fee of $1,000 in order to go. And I didn't have the $1,000. So I called up Matt Fitzgerald, the then senior minister here at the Hills Church, and I said, Matt, here's the situation. Is there any help you can offer? And so Matt said, yes, I've got a discretionary fund. The Hills Church will cover the cost of your tuition. Which I was deeply grateful for at the time. And then the next year, when I had a job that actually paid money, I made sure I upped my pledge again. And it gave me such joy to be able to do that. To be in a situation where I could do that. And then when I served the church in Iowa, I'm someone who doesn't have any debt, doesn't have any kids, so I'm like, of course I can tithe. I can give 10% of my pre-tax income to the church. A lot of people can't do that. Most people can't do that. I can, so I'm going to. And it's great to be able to do that. Because I remember that at one point in the past, things weren't so good. When I was in Houston at that same luncheon with that church member, the speaker who was being honored that day was a Houston businessman. He was in real estate. And he'd gotten his start at real estate in the late 70s, early 80s, which if you know stuff about Houston, was like boom times in Houston. And everyone was making money hand over fist, and this guy was building apartments and things. And then if you know anything about Houston, you know that in the mid-80s, the price of oil dropped. Houston became a ghost town, and people went bankrupt left, right, and center. And this guy had to sell his house. He came this close to going bankrupt. And as he came out of that, he had a meeting with his minister at the Presbyterian church there, and he said, If, God willing, I am successful going forward, I'm going to give away 50% of my company's profits to people in need. He ended up being one of the most successful developers over the last 30 years in Houston, and as a result, is one of the best-known philanthropists in the entire city. But one thing that he never forgot, that he was once a slave in Egypt. Now, giving is something that is deeply personal for everyone, as it should be. But at the same time, it can bring such joy and satisfaction to be able to give the things you care about. I remember last year, one of my close friends was in financial trouble. And this close friend came to me for help, and it was a big amount of money. And I remember thinking to myself, what should I do? And I talked to my friend Jimmy about this, and we were having dinner across my table, the very same table that's over in the parsonage. And as we were talking, Jimmy leaned over and he said, John, what is the point of money if you can't give it to something that you love? You have the opportunity to sit down in the next month and figure out where you want to give your money to different causes. And there are lots of them, and please, give generously and broadly. Think about where you are in your financial circumstances that make sense for you right now. Pray about it. Remember you were once a slave in Egypt. And think about where the Hills Church fits into that mix. These are important issues. These are moral issues. I know you take them seriously. And as I said at the end of my stewardship letter that hopefully you received recently, I do believe there is yet more truth and light to break forth from God's holy word. And I can't wait to see what that's going to mean for us here and to do that with all of you.